There are some technological innovations that have changed the game for the use of and development of computer technology. Open source is one such thing, which is the topic of today's discussion. So, first things first, we're just going to go over the agenda. We're going to briefly discuss what is open source, how it's based in source code, a historical overview of its coming into existence and its growth and popularity. What's the difference between open source and other software? So we have the open source software and, of course, the proprietary software that is not open source. How licenses affect that, they're the major difference. Some benefits and drawbacks of open source and utilizing open source software. What's the significance been? What has it really done for technology, the internet, ITM in general? And then finally, we're going to wrap up with some advocacy for open source tech and specific examples of that and what that really all means. So first, what is open source? Open source is a type of computer software that people can modify and share because it's designed to be publicly accessible. Ultimately, anyone can use the program for any purpose. There are no licensing fees or other restrictions on the software. What began solely as a specific approach to designing computer programs has morphed into a culture of open exchange via open source initiatives and projects. This open exchange has led to the development of countless amounts of new software and made it accessible for those who otherwise could not afford costly programs. And it's really been known to promote innovation through sharing. What's truly important to innovation because it creates a level of accessibility, creativity available to the masses of software engineers, both professional and novice. And since its inception, open source software has been responsible for innumerable new software concepts. It's truly kind of a conglomeration of accessibility, limitless creativity, and collaborative effort by coders. So, what really is at the source or the core of open source is the source code, and a lot of us don't know what this is, but it's what makes open source programs essentially. It's the code computer programmers can manipulate to change how a piece of software or program or application works. Programmers can improve programs via source code by adding features to it or fixing parts that don't already work or are just slow or outdated. Now, a historical kind of overview of what open source is. So, when it first began, it was pretty controversial. In 1998, Netscape, a well known browser maker, made the decision to make their source code public. So, it was no longer solely accessed by their programmers, but basically anyone had access to the code from which they could manipulate it, edit it, or just, review it for both learning and business purposes. Um, the initial response was pretty mixed. I think an interesting fact is that in 2001, the CEO of Microsoft at the time, Steve Ballmer, likened open source Linux to a cancer. But by 2016, Microsoft joined the Linux Foundation. So it's kind of ironic how it transitioned in popularity pretty rapidly. And then in 2002, Firefox was launched as a result of Netscape's open source code. So we all know Firefox, and it was a huge cornerstone of the movement towards its precedence in the tech in open source's precedence in the tech society, because this was like the first really big thing that kind of came of open source tech. And then finally, we can say that in 2018, open source had its 20th anniversary. So it's been in the world for 20 years now, and it's a pretty big deal. So seeing the difference, what is the difference between open source software versus traditional software? So firstly, as we mentioned before, the key to open source is that it's accessible to everyone. On the other hand, there's traditional software, which without open source creation would be all we have access to. Traditional software, proprietary software, there's lots of different names, just non-open source software is designed by a source code that only one person or entity has access to modify. It's private. These types of programs are also called proprietary or private. Now, from its inception, open source is different. A program's original authors make the source code public to anyone who can edit. Um, Licenses, this is another major difference. You'll see that licenses, they're probably the biggest distinction between the two, the bread and butter, so to say. Similarity between the licenses in proprietary and open source licensing is there are legal terms. Open source modification also requires the acceptance of a license and certain terms and conditions that a coder or modifier would need to abide by. This being said, open source licensing is much less complicated or restricting than that of the proprietary ones. Where open source's license are often an outline of the study, modification, and distribution of software, oftentimes requiring that the release of new software, the designer also publish the source code without a fee. Examples include Eclipse or Mozilla public license, which we were familiar with. And then proprietary license include a copyright with specific conditions. So you'll think of some pretty sophisticated programs that people want to protect that intellectual property of, like Google Earth, iTunes, Adobe Photoshop, are all really well-known examples of some proprietary licensed software that's non-open source. Now let's think about what are some of the benefits of open source. So there's a lot on the line when it comes to selecting your software type for your business. You need something that can provide you with both security, flexibility, and can grow with you as you learn the ropes of source coding. Open source programs can encapsulate all of this, which I think is really important. Power of the crowd. There's a collective power of a community of programmers working in at the same time that delivers not only more ideas, but the quicker development and troubleshooting when issues arise, which allows programs you're using to constantly being improving themselves. There's also to take into consideration reliability. All of the benefits truly do surround the community of programmers participating in open source. The reliability of open source code tends to be superior because there's an overarching group testing, editing, and constantly contributing. With a worldwide community supporting a code base rather than one team within one company, the output tends to be superior to that private paid software. Here's just a nice idea, I think, of along the lines of security, best stated by Linus Torvalds, the creator of Linux. Give enough eyeballs, security is a power benefit of open source because so many people are testing the code. They're going to find the holes very quickly and ensure that you or your users a secure program. A final benefit to take into account is this idea of free. Now, not all open source is free. Like, there is a lot of small fees associated with coding and open source tech, but it stands as much for freedom as it does for cost, which is significantly lower than your other paid software counterparts. Between the purchase price of the software, the cost of mandatory virus protection, support charges, continuous upgrade expenses, proprietary software takes more out of your pocket, and it's ultimately a lower quality at a higher price. In consideration of FreeCom, open source frees you from the vendor lock-in, which heavily dictates how you can use the programs of proprietary licensed source programs and prohibits you from editing the source code and ultimately limits something you are already paying for. So that's a huge, I'd say, probably one of the biggest highlighted benefits of open source is this no vendor lock-ins. Now, of course, we have to take into consideration some drawbacks. There's a lack of warranty. Because proprietary software has control of their code at all times, they're able to provide a warranty that open source could not possibly because it's open and editable to anyone. Conventional open source licenses typically contain only a limited warranty and no liability or infringement indemnity protections. So that's, of course, an issue, especially when you take into consideration kind of the effect intellectual property has on society and business today. There's also a lot of hidden costs. Some open source software is free upfront, but later costs money in the long run as you become more dependent on the program, and this can be a costly issue. Of course, this is not true of all open source programs, but it's common to have hidden fees or only the basic version available without some pay upgrade. Additional examples of fees include support, customizing, setting up, maintenance, and importing data, all depending on the program. All of these can be attached to fees. Also, there's a difficulty of use. This really depends on the program, but some open source applications may be difficult to set up and use, particularly for those new to programming. Others may lack user-friendly interfaces or features that you or possibly your business may not be familiar with. This can ultimately have a big effect on your productivity. Okay, so what's the significance? What this is really what it all comes down to. And in 2015, a study found that 78% of companies use open source software. This includes IBM, Microsoft, AT&T, Panasonic, and even Facebook. Not only has it been something we all as internet users rely on, but it's really reinvented the internet as we know it today. Open source code now powers about 90% of the internet and is being rapidly adopted across major enterprises. Because it is so communal and collaborative, programs and software have been created that never would have existed had it not been available for everyone. It's largely free to use. So we can say it's wholly developed the programs we are heavily reliant on today, and businesses and consumers and individuals really owe a lot to it as we've seen a progression in tech for us in the last 20 years. So advocacy for open source, I think this is, we discussed it in class, and I think it's an interesting aspect of open source that there's kind of these like organizations looking out for it and protecting the integrity of open source technology. It's a major aspect of open source culture, meaning its a goal is to increase the awareness and improve the perception of open source software. Also, this can include opposing proprietary software, intellectual property, copyrights, and patents. Two major examples of this is the Open Source Initiative and the Linus Foundation. So firstly, the Linux Foundation. In their own words, this foundation is dedicated to building sustainable ecosystems around open source projects to accelerate technology development and commercial adoption. They provide both financial and intellectual resources to further the dominance of open source tech. Linux and its projects have more than 1,000 corporate members, including IBM, Microsoft, Intel, Oracle, Hitachi, really big names we know. So it's not niche, it's very mainstream. Linux sources the Android kernel, which runs 80% of the world's smartphones. More than 75% of cloud-enabled enterprises report using Linux as their primary cloud platform. So it really has a lot of autonomy and sovereignty in the open source tech world. Most global markets run on Linux, including the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, the London Exchange, the Tokyo Exchange. And so that's what Linux is. And then this foundation is really their open source advocacy behind it. So this is obviously a really massive influence foundation that is doing a lot for open source. Yeah, as you can see here, this is just like a graph showing how likely a certain company is to be utilizing an open source program. And across all industries, you see a 37% chance, which is still pretty high considering. And then, of course, with tech, large tech, you see 77%. So it's nothing to ignore. It's definitely an influential aspect in the growing tech and business world. And then the second and final advocacy group we're going to be looking at is The open source initiative, which they describe themselves as a nonprofit that works to promote and protect open source software projects and communities, championing software freedom in society through education, collaboration, and infrastructure, stewarding the open source definition, OSD, and preventing abuse of the ideals and ethos inherent to the open source movement. Um, OSI, which is Open Source Initiative for short, they basically promote open source that is higher quality, better reliability, greater flexibility, lower cost, and an end to predatory vendor lock-in, which we discussed earlier, which is obviously kind of a huge issue with other forms of software. And yeah. So to conclude what we've talked about today, we've discussed what is open source, kind of its historical background, what source code is, what it even means, what's the difference really between that and regular forms or traditional forms of software, and why it kind of stands out as something that's been controversial but incredibly beneficial. As well as the drawbacks, because they do exist, that can have hidden fees. It can be difficult to understand. There's inefficiencies that exist. What's the significance been? So, how has it affected, tech in the long run? Now it's really dominates. Open source tech has really revolutionized how we use the internet, how we use technology, how we use software, and it really dominates the business world, particularly amongst tech companies. And then finally, this advocacy for open source tech that we discussed with the Open Source Initiative and the Linux Foundation, kind of these big names that are driving open source software and kind of the integrity of open source as it exists. All right, well, these are my sources. Thank you for watching. My name is Claire Schneider, and this has been for ITM 2000.